Welcome to In the Reads, the podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. My name is Collin Bartolomei, and in this episode, I'll be speaking with Samantha Hsiung, pronouns she, her, winner of Read Magazine issue 156's Emerging Voices contest, about her poem, A Soldier Burning Four Bolts. Samantha is a student of the University of Pennsylvania, whose writing is featured in such publications as the West Trestle Review, Frontier Poetry, and the Red Wheelbarrow, among others. Her work has also been recognized by the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum, Hollins University, and Columbia College, Chicago. Samantha's poem was chosen by Read Issue 156's design and layout director and senior art editor, Sierra Simpkins, who calls the work a bold and striking visual that, quote, artfully connects substance with style. Now, without further ado, here's Samantha to read in her own voice her poem, A Soldier Burning Four Bolts.
A soldier burning four bolts. And I am a soldier, in language my prey, the distance between us a whisper. On the field, I learn weapons, a currency of death, how to domesticate bodies, fuse flesh into stone. I forget history, forget memory. Unlearning capitalism, I forge an economy of violence. Daybreak, and I shoot a dog in the head, hammer it into steel. My eyes like pearls, I worship what I can't see. I cannibalize red, liquidate desire, retract all forms of love. My only music, Mao's voice. Literature, a map of the sun, a catalog of death and denial and destruction. And when I return to my family, I am not a son, but a foreigner. My motherland, the flag around my neck, hanging like a scar, a permanency.
Good afternoon, Samantha, or Sam. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you and good to talk to you. I look forward to discussing your poem, A Soldier Burning Four Olds. It was really interesting to read and quite beautiful, just in terms of, you know, a visual also. What drew you to the history of this? Was it something that, you've known your whole life, or your family telling you about this, or
Definitely not. I actually first learned about the Cultural Revolution in this after school program thing I was in where we would read a bunch of books. And one of them was called Red Scarf Girl. I think I forgot who the author was, but it was basically history of the Cultural Revolution recounted from the point of view of a really young girl. And I just thought the history surrounding that was really interesting because I never really learned about it before. And obviously, everything that happened within that was incredibly brutal. And I think I was around, it might have been 10 when I read this. So I didn't really remember it later on until around sophomore year of high school. I relearned the history of the Cultural Revolution when I was taking world history. And I also learned about the Tiananmen Square massacres, and also because the Xinjiang massacres were also happening at the time, I just learned, yeah, so much more about China's brutal history, well, history and things that are happening now. So, yeah, that's kind of why I decided to write about this poem because I also wanted to just continue exploring that history further because I felt like I had really surface level knowledge of it.
well, I mean, you basically answered my question. I just wanted to. The Red Scarf Girl was written by Jiling Zhang, I believe, or Zhang.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting, how much of culture can be sort of hidden away, or not spoken about, um, and that we have to often learn about our own cultural history through books and media, and you know not through our loved ones per se, but
Mhm,
it's good that we have these other outlets to learn history and
mhm.
about culture and
Yeah, for sure.
contexts. I want to talk a little bit more about the actual, structure and like the format of the poem. And the visual style in particular was just very striking. And I just love how it looks like an artwork in of itself, just with the ash symbol. So how was it your process? How did this visual style, start to take shape when you were starting work on this? And what appealed to you most about writing through the lens of, let's say, absence in the ash symbol?
Right. So I think the idea for using this character, Hua, like the fire character, as part of a poem came to me before the idea of the poem actually did. I remember I had been reading a lot of poems where the structure of the poem would mirror the content of the poem. And I had been like working a little bit with that myself. Like I would use a lot of slashes in my poems. I think one of them to indicate like stabbing. And I just really was interested in the way that um Chinese characters really looked this like they looked like what they represented. And my parents had been like grilling me to work on my Chinese writing of it. So yeah, this idea just like I don't remember exactly how it came to me, but there were definitely like many different inspirations that kind of just came together in my head. And um I think I just decided to like figure out the most meaningful way to make use of this kind of discovery I made. So I think the first thing that had been on my mind for a while was the brutal things that happened to Chinese people during the Cultural Revolution, just because at the time I was learning about that in class. And I also remembered from like a lot of different sources, news articles, books I had read they would that red guards would burn everything. So I was like, okay, if these people burn things, then I also just like know that this character actually represents fire. Like putting it together would be, I think it would send a really, really impactful message, especially since it literally looks like all the words within the poem are being set aflame and doused in fire. And I think within my poem, I also capitalized the worlds. I originally didn't do that, but I think I wanted to make it clear, like that, well, I thought that if I capitalized them, it would make these four worlds kind of look like more physical conglomerate things, I guess. Like look like one specific thing that stands out from the text instead of just like meshing together with all of the other words I had within the text. So yeah, that was the reason why I did that. And
Yeah,
uh
I'm glad you brought up the capitalization, because that was one of the things that really stood out to me. And you mentioned in your aside that, the capitalized words are examples of the four olds, the
Mhm,
concept of the poem, really. And You know, uh, one thing that I kept thinking about, and actually, as a little aside myself, I found it really interesting how the capitalization offers basically an entirely separate way of reading the poem. You can read all of the words, but you can also just read the capitalized words, and you basically have
mhm,
an entirely different experience reading the poem if you focus on just the capitalization. And with
mhm.
that in mind, um, is it fair to say that the speaker, the capital I in this poem is included in that capitalization that you mentioned in your aside? And, and that is that the soldier is possibly, four olds personified, and therefore the very thing that Mao and his Red Guards sought to eradicate.
Yeah, I do think it's fair to say that though. I do not think I was like consciously thinking about the fact that the I is capitalized, which mirrors the four worlds in the poem. But For sure, because the identity of these Red Guards were very much erased. They kind of they just identified themselves as Red Guards, these people who would go into other people's homes and burn everything. And they were brainwashed in a way. So in the process, you kind of just lose yourself and who you are. So yeah, I definitely agree with that interpretation of it.
When it comes to any sort of militaristic, structure or I guess collection of people, military or otherwise, you're sort of forced into conformity, into a role. And at the end of the day, these Red Guards, they are just people. They are just trying to live their lives and survive while also still having to follow these orders that they may or may not even agree with. So
Mhm.
it's interesting the capitalization, which even though you may not have been thinking about it, I think it's quite an interesting interpretation that yes, these are people, and maybe they are a part of what Mao, didn't want, wanted to get rid of, but, he needed them.
Mhm.
It's a fascinating poem, and there's so many ways to look at it, and that's the best kind of poetry is the ones that you can look at from several different points of view and just get an entirely different experience. And with that in mind, more broadly or bigger picture here, um, in terms of the history, how do you see this history of the Cultural Revolution as contemporary with today's Chinese social cultural landscape? And how do you think the legacy of that is still present today?
Yeah, so I think today's landscape in China, socio-political landscape, is obviously better than it was when the Cultural Revolution happened, but I think it definitely has very, very, very eerily similar elements to what happened back then. And I think it's really it's like difficult for the entire world to kind of know what's happening, but not the actual people, like Chinese people, for example, in China, don't really I don't think they really know about the Xinjiang massacres because it's not obviously not publicized in the news and it's just completely censored. So I think that in a way is also a sort of brainwashing similar to the type of brainwashing that occurred during the Cultural Revolution. And it's really horrible that it's still happening.
Yeah, it's almost like I suppose a legacy of erasure and suppression in
For
certain
sure.
ways, which
Mhm.
is it's sad to see today that that's still an ever present, danger of, just information and history being shut down and, erased.
Yeah. And even with in times when I go back and visit China, for example, they have the firewall, so you can't even access traditional US outlets like Google or whatever. So some of the time the news I'm getting from um the news I'm getting about the US is from my friends and or yeah, or the news I'm getting about China is also from my friends who are literally living in the US and not at the center of where the news is actually happening, which I think is like funny in a way, but also very, very twisted.
Yeah, I mean it's good to have connections in different places to have a more, truer or fuller picture of what is going on in the world. I think it's the human connection is really crucial to being able to understand our world and, you know, uh, the events that are happening today.
Mhm.
So, talking about your poem a little bit more, I am curious what made you choose to go back a little bit, what made you choose to focus from the soldier's perspective rather than from the victims of this?
I think a lot of poems in this sort of genre are written from the victim's perspective. And I think for this specific scenario, the soldier himself or herself is also a victim. So I think you could kind of view it from that lens. Like they are the perpetrators of this crime, but they are victims of like this kind of suppressed and yeah, the suppressed environment, oppressive environment that they're in. So I would say that um, it was kind of about giving light to or shedding light on just a different angle. Like, I don't know. I think I like to explore different types of perspectives in my poetry and like perspectives that people wouldn't really be thinking about in the moment. So yeah, I'd say that was the reason why.
Yeah, I like your wording there, giving light or shedding light on these typically, underrepresented groups, which, it's important even if they are, generally considered, the bad guy or whatever, to, still recognize that there is humanity there and that it's important to understand what's going on and what's going wrong and maybe the influences that led to these terrible tragedies throughout history and even today. So, I mean, I'm glad you said that. It's really important that we don't, overlook these people, even if they are, you know, doing things that are just truly terrible for the world and society. But I'm curious, what do you really hope that readers take away from your poem?
Mm, I really, really hope that people who read the poem that don't really know about the Cultural Revolution and everything that happened decide to dig deeper into that because I think that it's kind of just something that people learn about in history class, but it really should be like an integral part of their knowledge. And I guess from a craft perspective, I want people well, I would hope that people kind of know that poetry doesn't necessarily have to just be words on a page. Like there are ways to combine it with art and language, like yeah, language to make it more powerful and more impactful than just merely words on a page. And I guess last thing would be that poetry can be political for sure. Um, and you don't have to really be afraid of making it political. I think a lot of people, when they write poetry, they think of nature, the beauty of the world. Um, I don't know, things similar to that. But in reality, it can be a really, really powerful device for just giving light to topics that people don't necessarily want to talk about.
Very well said. I mean, and in my opinion, and I think you'd probably agree with me here, but there really isn't anything in this world that isn't in some way political. Even something as simple as nature. I mean, just look
It's
at
true.
climate change. I mean,
Mm,
there's so much in this world that is just reliant on us and our actions and how we treat the world and each other so that everything that we know really is political in some form or another, which I think it's crucial to remember, and I think your poem really attests to that in a really beautiful way, and in a way I've never really seen before in poetry, because as you said, I mean, yeah, most poetry is just, words on the page, but you brought something really unique and beautiful and visual to it that I really appreciated because it's unlike m most poetry I've ever seen, which it really, it stayed with me.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
So I know you're really busy. You're I believe you're in your first or one of your first
Yeah,
semesters at
I'm a
college.
freshman right now, freshman in
That
college.
must be fun and stressful. And I know finals are coming up. I'm stressing about it too. Um, so, what brought you to read? Why did you choose to submit with us? And how was that process like? Did it meet your expectations? Did it subvert them?
I was definitely surprised when I won just because I don't know. I don't think I ever expect to win in any contest that I submit to. And I think the sorry, there's like screaming outside my dorm right now, but I think the way that everything happened was also really interesting. So basically, one of my literature teachers, well, she wasn't necessarily my literature teacher, but she did advise two of the clubs I was in. She was kind of just advertising that everyone submit to Read Magazine, and I just decided to take the opportunity because I thought, why not? Like, I don't know. I've like submitted to a bunch of other contests before. Sometimes don't get anything, sometimes do. So, yeah, and especially since Read Magazine's contest was targeted towards emerging writers, I thought it would be a good opportunity for me as well, since I do classify myself as an emerging writer. So, yeah, I don't think it like I wouldn't say it like subverted my expectations, but it was definitely unexpected for me to win. And I think Reed has just been a really, really welcoming environment and place in general. I think like they always, you guys, I guess, always follow up with emails and are just very nice in your interactions with me. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that everything was, pretty you know, good for you in terms of the process. I know that in terms of publishing, it can be really hard to, get any actual responses. It really is just a trial and, silence and no's and etc. So I'm glad that you were you were part of issue 156 and your poem was just really good and
You.
just beautiful. All right, so yeah, any advice for your fellow emerging voices, not just from Reed, but in the larger literary community?
I think that it's really important to read a lot of poetry before you write a lot of poetry, or read a lot of prose before you write a lot of prose. So I think people who want to start writing but don't know where to begin should definitely just read up on both contemporary and um, poets that are not as contemporary, that like go back, like the romantic poets, for example. I remember when I was learning about the romantic poets in my AP English class, I think it definitely inspired a lot of my poetry more than I thought it would. I think some of it was also in a subconscious way. So, yeah, I guess that's one piece of advice. And I think also for emerging writers to not be afraid of writing about weird things. I think a lot of my poems have not really been about like conventional things you would see in anyone else's writing. So just write about whatever you want to write about and don't feel constrained or feel like, oh, I have to use this amount of similes and this amount of metaphors, this amount of hyperboles. Just like don't follow that. It's okay. Just do it however you want to do it. And eventually you'll probably create your own writing style that you feel very comfortable with, but it's okay if it starts off as uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's great advice. I love that. We all have to find a way to carve our own space out in the literary community, and I think we're all capable of it. And definitely, I 100% agree with you on, reading. I've had a professor that lived by the idea of, all great writers are great readers, and that you need to be a good reader, a great reader, in order to be a good or a great writer.
For
So
sure.
it's very important to keep reading and to be as well read in all different kinds of literature, prose, poetry, etc. Anyway, in I want to talk a little bit about the future. I want to know, are you working on anything new? Do you have anything coming up soon, or anything that you can talk about, or you're excited about? And where should people look to see what you've got coming up next?
Um, Honestly, I really want to eventually publish like a poetry chapbook, but I feel like especially during college, it's kind of difficult to do just because I feel so busy with all these other things that are happening in college. But I think over the summer I'll definitely be writing a lot more. I do not think there is something that will like I don't think that I'll like release a poetry chapbook or get something like a poetry chapbook published in the near future, but there are definitely pieces that I'm working on that I probably will send out for publication. And there's actually a spoken word poetry group that I'm a part of on campus. It's called the Axolana Project. And for that spoken word poetry group, I've had to write a lot of pieces for show and things like that. So if you go to their YouTube, you could probably like watch videos of me as well as all the other amazing performers that are in the club. Um, yeah, but definitely working on things, though nothing really, really big coming up.
Well, I can't wait to see where you go from here. And I just want to thank you on behalf of all of Read Magazine for taking part in not only this podcast, but in issue 156. We really appreciate your work. It was great to have you in issue 156. And it was great talking to you, Sam. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for the interview.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you reaching out.
yeah. It has been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you again to our guest, Samantha Hsiung. This has been In the Reads, the podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. Find us on YouTube at In the Reads Podcast and readmag.org. Thanks for listening.